welcome everyone. For those of you who have been following Parliament, you must have seen many MPs talking about the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill. Many of us are thinking about what this bill are. Many think it doesn't concern us, and so you just flipped the channel, moved on. Even I did. But for some reason, many people have been asking me why I'm not so concerned about this. They've been sending me articles and WhatsApp forwards about this, and made me sit up, take notice. And I have asked a couple of people who have been studying this issue for the last decade or so. Apar is the co-founder of Internet Freedom Foundation. He's a lawyer who writes extensively on democracy and digital rights technology in India. Ria is a public interest lawyer working on digital rights and socioeconomic rights. She also works with the Rethink Aadhaar campaign. So let me begin, Apar and Ria, by asking each one of you, apart from those who are already socialized to this issue, why should anyone else really care about what's happening right now? I mean, isn't this in a sense an elite function? How does the Aam Janta get affected by this? Do you want to start, Ria?
Yeah, sure. I'll start and Apar can
Sure.
step in. The formulation of privacy as an elitist concept is something the state tried to do a lot. I think it was 5 years ago when the right to privacy case was being argued in court. The idea of privacy is really about about the concept of control. What kind of control do you as an individual have over other people in making incursions into your life? Right? So there's different versions of what privacy looks like. It's privacy over the information related to me. It's privacy over the decisions that I'm making. It's privacy over my bodily space. Right? So it relates very closely to the idea of liberty in today's world. I think when we live in a state where in a world where the state has a monopoly on power. Right? And so any information about me could be used by the state, right? While it is exercising that power.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why I have to have some way of saying, look, these are not things you need to know about me, right? So that I have some way of addressing that imbalance in power between me and the state.
Sure.
पुष्पराज थोड़ा हिंदी थोड़ा इंग्लिश कर लूँ, ठीक है?
Perfect.
तो अगर हम देखें मतलब इंडिया में अब आज की डेट पे सबके पास एक ना एक, मतलब अगर शहरों में तो देखें स्मार्टफोन तो होता ही है, सबकी एक फैमिली में होता ही है, और उससे उनका मतलब परिवार तो जुड़ा ही है, पर उनका सारा काम, सारा मतलब समाज से जो भी उनका मतलब कनेक्शन है वो जुड़ा हुआ है। वो स्मार्टफोन के ज़रिए आप देखिए आपका कितना डेटा जा रहा है, कितने सेंसर लगे, और इनफैक्ट हम वही स्मार्टफोन चाहते हैं जिसमें ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा सेंसर हैं, हमारी बॉडी के बारे में, हमारे खाते के बारे में, हमारे मतलब जिनसे बात कर रहे हैं सबके बारे में, जो भी हम बात कर रहे हैं वो स्मार्टफोन में नहीं है। मतलब वो सरकार के पास भी है, कुछ में कॉर्पोरेशंस के पास भी है, जैसे गूगल है, फेसबुक है, उन सब के पास हमारा पर्सनल डेटा रखा हुआ है। तो इसके लिए एक कानून ऐसा बनना चाहिए जिसमें हम सब का मतलब द सिटीजन्स इंटरेस्ट इज प्रोटेक्टेड, है ना, बनना चाहिए ना। और सरकार को वही डेटा लेना चाहिए जो हमारे हित में वो जो काम कर रही है वो उसमें हो, तो तभी एक डेटा प्रोटेक्शन कानून की ज़रूरत है, और इससे सब पे प्रभाव पड़ता है। सबसे पहली बात ये है। दूसरी बात ये है, जब हम ये बात बहुत बारी बोलते हैं कि ऐसा एक कानून होना चाहिए और सरकार को एक सीमा में रहना चाहिए उस कानून के, सबसे पहला प्रश्न ये पूछा जाता है आपको छुपाने को क्या है अगर आप कुछ गलत नहीं कर रहे? बहुत कुछ छुपाने को है। आप अपना फोन दीजिए, व्हाट्सएप की हिस्ट्री दिखाइए मुझे। नहीं दिखाना चाहते हैं ना किस किस से बात कर रहे हैं? बिल्कुल नहीं। लोग अपने रिश्तेदारी में नहीं दिखाना चाहते क्या क्या वो बात कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि एक जो एकांत होता है, एक जो हमारी थॉट प्रोसेस होती है, जो हम सर्च हिस्ट्री में डालते हैं, वो हमारे अंदर की जो सारी जो थिंकिंग प्रोसेस होती है वही डिफाइन करती है कि हम क्या है, कौन है, और उसके बाद हम एक कॉन्शियस डिसीजन लेते हैं हम किसके साथ शेयर करेंगे। तो ये जो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन कानून आ रहा है, जो ये सरकार ने 9 साल लिए हैं बनाने में, ये आपके हित में नहीं है, ये उनके हित में है, और कुछ कॉरपोरेशंस के हित में है कि वो ये डेटा गैदर कर पाएं। आपको कभी कभी बताएंगे भी नहीं कि आपसे क्या डेटा ले रहे हैं, वो किस तरीके से इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, और सरकार इससे आपके स्मार्टफोनों में किसी ना किसी तरीके से घुसती जाएगी।
ओके, तो लेट मी जस्ट क्विकली फॉलो अप विथ यू हियर
Yes.
अपार।
यस।
आप कह रहे हो कि सरकार ने ये बिल बनाया है,
हाँ.
अभी जो लाया है,
हाँ।
अब आम जनता यही कह रही है कि तो सरकार हमारे हित के लिए कर रही है। आप कैसे सरकार अपनी है, आप कैसे कह सकते हो कि सरकार कोई कानून लाएगा जो हमारे हित में नहीं है? आप बिल के माध्यम से आप बताइए।
बिल के माध्यम से सबसे पहली बात ही मैं ये बताऊंगा कि जो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन लॉ है, अगर आप देखें 11 साल 12 साल पहले देखें जब ये सारी कार्यप्रणाली शुरू हुई थी, तो डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ पर्सनल एंड पेंशन्स में एक प्रिवेसी बिल ड्राफ्ट हो रहा था जिसमें डेटा प्रोटेक्शन तो एक उसमें मुद्दा था ही, उसमें सर्वेलेंस रिफॉर्म भी एक और मुद्दा था।
ये 2012-13 की बात है।
हाँ, 11 से मतलब 12-13 तक की बात है। तो उसमें हमें यह समझना चाहिए जब कोई हमसे पूछ के हमारा पर्सनल डेटा रहता है वो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन होती है।
Right.
और इसका एक जुड़ा हिस्सा होता है सर्विलेंस, मतलब जब हमें बिना बताए हमसे डेटा लिया जाता है, मतलब निगरानी रखी जाती है हमारे पर, वो सर्विलेंस करी जाती है ज़्यादातर जैसे पुलिस डिपार्टमेंट करती है वो सब, पर ये दोनों बहुत जुड़े हुए हैं। तो सबसे पहले जो सरकार इस बारी डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बिल लाई है, जो थर्सडे को लाई है, अगस्त 3 को लाई है, उसमें सिर्फ डेटा प्रोटेक्शन है, सर्विलेंस रिफॉर्म नहीं है। तो मतलब जैसे अगर आप देखें सीसीटीवी कैमरा सब जगह लग गए हैं, फेशियल रिकग्निशन सब जगह लग गया है, और आज की डेट पे कुछ स्टेट इलेक्शन कमीशन तो ये भी बोल रहे हैं कि फेशियल रिकग्निशन के माध्यम से वो ये टेस्ट करेंगे कि आप क्या कहते हैं जब भी अपना वोट देंगे आप वो व्यक्ति हैं जो इलेक्टोरल रोल पे हैं, तो उस पर डेटा प्रोटेक्शन लगना चाहिए नहीं लगना चाहिए, आप सोचो। पर इस कानून के वजह से बहुत सारी शंकाएं पैदा हो गई हैं कि ये प्रोटेक्शन आपको नहीं मिलेगी। सो इट विल इम्पैक्ट योर लीगल राइट्स इन अ whole host of ways. This is a much thinner law, it has much broader exemptions, and it reserves a huge amount of discretion and exemptions for government.
Okay, so Riya, I just want to follow up with what Apar said. You know, what he's arguing that it gives the government and presumably government official carte blanche, blank check to access and use our data to do anything. Can you give us some examples on how the government could possibly use data? And I know that we are in the realm of probability, but I think it will be good for our viewers to get a sense of how the government could use and perhaps misuse the data, their personal data.
Yeah, thanks. I think in the current bill that is being discussed in Parliament, there are very broad exemptions given to the government. So there's a certain framework set out in the bill.
Sure.
Ki broadly, consent leke you can use my data.
Yeah.
Right? That's based on the principle that I should have some control over it. Ki theek hai, mujhe bata rahe ho, and I have an option to say no, I don't want you to use it. That's the idea why these kinds of bills are consent based. There are of course other exceptions, right, in bills around the world. Ki there are other ways in which you can use my data if you have some compelling reason to it. Humne contract, we entered into some kind of contract or something, and I have a reasonable understanding of what that data, what you will do with that data. In the current bill, there are some exceptions, right? The government can, if it is giving you any kind of subsidy, benefit, license, permit, right? The government can use your data without your consent if you have previously consented to it, or if that data has been digitized and the government has notified. Now, what does this mean? What is the type of data that the government may have access to that it has digitized, right? Entire Aadhaar database, right? Anything else that you may have given to any government department to seek some kind of license or permit. So imagine my house has got a LPG subsidy, right? My child is trying to go get maybe something unrelated. Maybe it's trying to get in another state some kind of scholarship, maybe, right? Merit-based scholarship. Somehow they can use the data based on this LPG subsidy to correlate it against what my child is doing in another state, right? Without you having any knowledge of it. What are the more insidious examples? What do you think?
So if you look at the application of the bill itself, it's exempted from publicly available data which has been made possibly through a social media post by Riya, you, or by me, or by you, Pushparaj. But if you remember, about 4 years ago, this government put out a tender for social media analysis, which means it wanted to make files on each citizen which uses social media, get to know their political opinions, their religious affiliations, their networks by itself. And we have much more recently seen that the digital ecosystem and narrative setting is quite often done on the basis of individual targeting. So it is not only a commercial advertiser, but also the government based on your social media posts, which can use it without any regulation under this bill. The other exemptions, Ria, which you were talking to, are under clause 17. So 17.2 says that a government entity can be exempted, which means that it is not exempted for a purpose for which it's conducting the work. For instance, national security, right? We would all agree that national security is one of the grounds under which a government entity should be exempted. But the government has the power to exempt the entity by itself rather than the much more narrower purpose, which is national security. Clause 17.3, it can exempt the private sector. And this is under very vague criteria. And startups. But every entity today claims to be a startup. So this bill and its protections just does not apply to it. And finally, clause 17.5 says that certain provisions and sections of the bill itself will not apply to certain classes of entities, which may be the public sector or the private sector, for a period of 5 years. Which means that this bill is not giving any protections, and it seems it's giving protections with one open palm, but it is pulling it back with both its hands itself. So there are no protections, there are wide exemptions. That's the way I would think about it conceptually, Ria.
Yeah. So, I mean, from what you are describing it's basically creating two universes from what you are describing. One is for the government and one is for, and whoever it deems can access data, can use data, and everyone else.
Yes.
So this is, I mean, I'm just trying to understand, I spoke recently to Nikhil Day about how this could impact adversely in REG and so on and so forth. And he says that, market research companies can't use data now, activists can't use data, and if we do without taking prior consent, it's difficult to take prior consent if you're analyzing muster rolls or electoral rolls, so on and so forth, which impacts political parties also. So anyone the government deems is not a good citizen or is not good enough to access use data can be fined, right? And what is the, I mean, I'm an activist, I'm analyzing muster rolls, ठीक है? I want to figure out कि corruption हो रहा है कि नहीं, muster rolls में गड़बड़ी हो रही है कि नहीं. If someone complains कि boss ये लोग misuse कर रहे हैं अपना आपके personal data का, आपके consent नहीं लिया है, what can happen to me?
This is a big issue, I think, in that how this bill in a way weaponizes the idea of privacy to encroach on established rights of transparency, and which really relates to government accountability.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the bill does is it takes away a very important RTI provision that achieves a kind of balancing between these two rights, privacy and transparency, and saying that, and what the bill proposes to do in the amendment is to remove from the ambit of public, from the ambit of what the public can access, anything that relates to personal data. Right, so which could conceivably include data of a muster roll of a particular kind of government work or something. The bill also says that defines a data breach as unauthorized processing. So conceivably, if you have got your hands on this kind of muster roll, you could conceivably be accused of facilitating a data breach for unauthorized processing of this.
And what happens to me then? There's a fine prescribed.
There's a fine.
Yeah.
Now the fine can be up to 250 crores, right?
Okay.
There is a process, right? Somebody can complain, and you go before the Data Protection Board, and the board will then determine whether there's enough grounds to proceed against this kind of complaint, and then can set a fine for a breach of this nature.
You're talking about the Digital Personal Board of India.
That's right.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 5. Now there's a lot to say about the board and the functioning of the board.
Yeah. And are there different categories of fines? Like, agar Yeah, are there different categories?
Yes, there's a schedule. There are different categories
There are
of fine.
different
उनमें अलग-अलग monetary penalty बताई गई है.
Sure.
और हर breach के लिए बोला गया है कि एक बारी data protection board इस पे fine लगा सकता है.
No, sorry, just to ask her this particular point about you said there's a lot to say about the data protection board itself. Do you guys want to shed light on why it's problematic? Just very briefly, because this is too technical a term.
तो सबसे पहले बताऊं, जिस आरटीआई के पॉइंट पे, इंफॉर्मेशन के पॉइंट पे मैं ये बताना चाहूँगा, जैसे मतलब कंसेप्चुअली पुष्पराज अगर हम सोचें, भारत की जो आज़ादी की लड़ाई थी उससे हमें संविधान मिला. उस संविधान अगर प्रियम्बल देखें उसमें जस्टिस, सोशल जस्टिस, लिबर्टी, इक्वालिटी, फ्रेटर्निटी का जो पाथ है, जो स्टेट का एम है बाय इटसेल्फ, वो ऐसे मिलता है जब नागरिक को अधिकार दिए जाते हैं. उन अधिकारों में आज की डेट पे इस डिजिटल सोसाइटी, जो स्मार्टफोन से हमारी दुनिया जुड़ी हुई है, जो गवर्नमेंट बोलती है सब कुछ डिजिटल इंडिया है, उसमें दो अधिकार बहुत बहुत अहम है. एक प्रिवेसी का, दूसरा अकाउंटेबिलिटी का. हमें पता होना चाहिए हमारे बारे में डिसीजन कैसे लिया जा रहा है डिजिटल इंडिया में हमारे डेटा के हिसाब से. और दूसरी चीज, उतना ही डेटा लेना चाहिए जितना जरूरी है. अब देखिए, अगर आप प्रिवेसी का इस्तेमाल करके पब्लिक अकाउंटेबिलिटी बिल्कुल हटा देंगे तो सरकार इससे बचेगी. और इसमें अगर आप देखें क्लॉज 44(3), ये सेक्शन 81J ऑफ आरटीआई एक्ट को कंप्लीटली डैमेज कर देता है. वो बोलता है कि कोई भी इंफॉर्मेशन विच रिलेट्स टू पर्सनल इंफॉर्मेशन विल नॉट बी शेयर्ड. तो मतलब आप मस्टर रोल, आप फाइन से पहले आपको तो इंफॉर्मेशन मिलेगी नहीं. आपके घर के आगे सड़क टूटी हुई है, कौन से कॉन्ट्रैक्टर ने बनाई है, सरकारी डिपार्टमेंट बोलेगा हम नाम ही नहीं बताएंगे उस कॉन्ट्रैक्टर का, क्योंकि उसमें उसकी पर्सनल डिटेल्स हैं. आरटीआई एक्ट अभी बोलता है कि दैट इज बैलेंस्ड अगेंस्ट पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट. इसी तरीके से पब्लिक अकाउंटेबिलिटी इस लेवल तक आई है कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने जजमेंट्स इशू करी है जिसमें सरकारों को बोला गया है कि यू हैव टू बी मोर ट्रांसपेरेंट. दूसरी चीज,
sorry, I want to get back here because it's an important point you're raising, Apar.
Yes.
By this logic, I can't ask about my election candidates' affidavits, can I?
No, you can.
I can.
You
okay.
can. मेरे हिसाब से उस पे डायरेक्ट फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा.
But their assets.
पढ़ सकता है, बाद में पढ़ सकता है, क्योंकि उसका जो प्राविधान है वो सुप्रीम कोर्ट की जजमेंट से आता है और फिर रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ पीपल एक्ट में अमेंडमेंट्स करी गई हैं. तो सम कैटेगरीज विल बी प्रोटेक्टेड. बट मेरे हिसाब से जो भी सरकारी हित में है वो इंफॉर्मेशन दी नहीं जाएगी और सिटीजन से और मोर एंड मोर इंफॉर्मेशन ली जाएगी. दूसरी बात जो रिया बोल रही थी, सपोजिंग मस्टर रोल की इंफॉर्मेशन या मतलब पूरी बेनिफिशियरी लिस्ट अगर मिल भी जाती है और लोगों से हमने कंसेंट नहीं लिया है, तो अनऑथराइज्ड यूज के लिए जो पेनल्टीज लगेंगी, वो जो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड लगाएगा, वो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड इसके लिए ही नहीं लगाएगा कि उस मस्टर रोल में जो लोग हैं उन्होंने कंप्लेंट डाली डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड के साथ, पर सरकार भी सुओ मोटो कंप्लेंट भेज सकती है. तो सोचिए, मस्टर रोल निकाल लिया या सर आपकी घर के आगे रोड टूटी हुई है, उसकी आपको इंफॉर्मेशन मिल गई, पर आपने उसके बेसिस पे एक जर्नलिस्ट से बात करके एक पेपर में छपवा दिया कि देखिए ये सारी दिक्कतें हो रही हैं इस गांव में, इस शहर में. सरकार उस पे एक रेफरेंस भेज सकती है डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड को कि देखिए इन्होंने तो पर्सनल इंफॉर्मेशन यूज कर ली उस कॉन्ट्रैक्टर की, उन लोगों की. तो सरकार का जो पावर है, मैं वो बताना चाह रहा हूं, वो इतनी बढ़ गई है. और जो डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड पे आप पूछ रहे हैं, वो अगर आप देखिए उसमें एक पूरा पैटर्न दिखता है जिसमें सरकार ये चुन रही है क्लॉज 20 में टर्म्स ऑफ सर्विस, मतलब उसमें लोग जो बैठेंगे वो किस तरीके से बैठेंगे, मतलब वो चुन सकती है उन्हें अपने हिसाब से. प्रोसीजर, मतलब आप कैसे सुनेंगे, जब सुनवाई कैसे करेंगे जब भी आप पे कंप्लेंट डलेगी. कुछ लिमिटेशंस हैं, प्रावधान हैं, पर क्लॉज 23 देखिए और 28 के साथ पढ़िए इस डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बिल के, वो ज्यादातर सरकार ही तय करेगी. डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बोर्ड को अगर जो 4-5 लोग हैं जो अपॉइंट अंडर द बिल ही हैं, वो खुद तो काम करेंगे नहीं, उन्हें एक दफ्तर चाहिए होगा, उन्हें लोग ऑफिसर्स अपॉइंट करने होंगे, असिस्ट करने होंगे, उनकी भी कंडीशन सरकार ही तय करेगी. तो आप सोचिए सरकार के पास कितनी पावर है, और ये सब एज मे बी प्रिस्क्राइब्ड है. तो इंस्टीट्यूशनल ऑटोनॉमी, रेगुलेटरी अथॉरिटी कुछ भी नहीं दी जा रही. इसमें सरकार का पावर बढ़ रही है, बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ रही है, और ये लोगों को समझना चाहिए. प्रिवेसी भी नहीं मिल रही और आपका सूचना का अधिकार भी जा रहा है।
तो
And
इसका
one more thing about the data protection board, वो clause 19, which is the सरकार can decide who the chairperson is and who the members are.
Yes.
तो सरकार खुद बिठाएगी वहाँ पे whoever they want to be the chairperson and who the members.
I mean, this is a very, I mean, हालांकि ये एक टेक्निकल बात है, लेकिन आप सोचिए अगर सरकार ही तय करेगी कि आप किस इन्फॉर्मेशन के बारे में नहीं पूछ सकते हैं, इफेक्टिवली दिल से कि बॉस हमने तो कोई गड़बड़ी की नहीं है, कोई करप्शन हो ही नहीं रहा है, कोई हमारे वहाँ कोई मैलफीजेंस हो ही नहीं रहा है, तो इसका मतलब आरटीआई एक्टिविस्ट और जो जर्नलिस्ट है, इन्वेस्टिगेटिव जर्नलिस्ट है, ये अपना काम ठीक से कर ही नहीं पाएंगे।
हाँ। और इसमें ये भी तो सोचना चाहिए हमें कि मतलब देखिए कि ऐसा डेटा प्रोटेक्शन कानून आप ला रहे हैं जिसमें आप सबसे पहले बोल रहे हैं हमारे को जो लगे गवर्नमेंट डिपार्टमेंट हम वो एग्जेम्प्ट कर देंगे, और उसके बाद अगर कोई कंप्लेंट डाल भी दे किसी और गवर्नमेंट डिपार्टमेंट पब्लिक अथॉरिटी के अगेंस्ट कि उन्होंने डेटा ब्रीच किया है मेरा, तो सरकार ने अपना ही बोर्ड बिठाया हुआ है। तो अ पब्लिक अथॉरिटी विच लैक्स institutional autonomy to levy fines etc and is to a large extent controlled by the government will determine how another government department will be either liable for a fine or not. This is a pure conflict of interest in that sense.
आप समझ रहे, बेसिकली ये चट्टे बट्टे की बात है, मैं ही काम करूंगा और मैं ही बोलूंगा कि ये लोग निगरानी रखेंगे मुझ पे और जवाबदेही मांगेंगे मुझसे।
हाँ, अगर नेशनल सिक्योरिटी पे एग्जाम्प्ट भी नहीं किया तब भी।
There are many ways that the government is maybe the biggest processor of data of Indian citizens today. You know, I think that's something we have to remember also. There's also an exemption for how employers can use data.
Yeah.
Who is the biggest employer of people? I think the government is a very, very big employer of people. Right? So there are all of these ways in which different types of data that can be that is collected by the government, right? The government is now proposing that we will use it as we like. We will share it in between departments as we like, right? Shouldn't we? It's also a question of our imagination. Shouldn't we see the government as a ideal data controller or ideal data fiduciary working in our best interest, rather than saying we may have the most kind of data and we want to exempt ourselves from everything. आप लोग कर लो जो कर रहे हो, right? It's a concept from labor law also, right? Where the government should be the ideal employer, should be giving, you know, wherever we've reached with that, right? But we should be looking to the government to set a
देनी
standard.
चाहिए सब कुछ, सारी protections देनी चाहिए.
Exactly, protections देनी चाहिए, rather than carving out big exemptions for itself, controlling how the law will be enforced, right? And then choosing to impose it onto other people, right? Which has created a divide between, which is how we started this conversation, a divide between people who worry about privacy and people who worry about other things like transparency. I think that's a false divide, because it's all, you know, privacy has been called a traveling right. It impacts all of your other rights also.
Sure.
Right? As an RTI activist, right? Of course, you want to be able to access all kinds of data. You don't want yourself to be under danger because your personal details have gone to some kind of bad actor, right? That's also part of it. That's where your privacy also comes in, right? It's about your security, your safety, those kinds of issues also.
जैसे भारत सरकार बहुत लोगों को काम देती है, रिया बता रही थी अभी, उसमें मैं 2 उदाहरण देना चाहूँगा। अभी हमने देखा है जैसे नरेगा वर्कर्स ने काफ़ी प्रोटेस्ट किया क्योंकि उनका अटेंडेंस एक स्मार्टफोन के ज़रिए रिकॉर्ड हो रहा था जिनमें उनकी फ़ोटो ली जाती थी, पर वो अटेंडेंस हर रोज़ मार्क नहीं हो रहा था, तो वो काम कर रहे थे, उन्हें पैसे नहीं मिल रहे थे, उनका डेटा भी लिया जा रहा था, मतलब फ़ोटो ही खींची जा रही है उन लोगों की। अब आप सोचेंगे चलो ये तो सही है, मुझे तो इससे कुछ फ़र्क नहीं पड़ेगा, पर आपने अगर स्कूल में अगर नौकरी कर ली एक टीचर की, अगर आप देखें क्या हो रहा है आंध्र प्रदेश में, उधर भी प्रोटेस्ट हो रहे हैं टीचर के, इसके लिए नहीं हो रहे कि उन्हें अटेंडेंस मार्क करना पड़ रहा है और वो स्कूल पढ़ाने नहीं जाते, पर वो सिस्टम कभी कभी चलता नहीं है, कभी कभी फेशियल बायोमेट्रिक मांगता है, इतनी डिटेल्स मांगता है आपसे, आपको लगता है कि मैं इधर पढ़ाने आया हूँ या ये मेरी जासूसी करने आए हैं। और इसमें मैं एक और चीज़ बताना चाहूँगा कि अगर हम देखें इस पूरे प्रपोजल डेटा प्रोटेक्शन बिल में पहली बारी मैंने देखा है, वो रिया से भी बात हो रही थी कि ड्यूटीज इंपोज हो रही है रिया।
I think this is a new form of governance, where as citizens we have to be duty first rather than recipients of rights or exercising
I don't think so.
our
It
rights.
exists in comparative data protection statutes.
I haven't seen that.
Neither have I.
So the kinds of duties that are imposed on people are, you have a duty to not make a false complaint or a frivolous complaint to the data protection board. तो जब आप जा सकते हैं data protection board के पास को I think my data is being has been breached or my rights are being violated in some way, the data protection board will first check is this a false or frivolous complaint and then can impose a penalty on you.
Wow.
If it's found that you've been violating this up to 10,000 rupees.
Yeah.
Now that is a clear mechanism to disincentivize anyone from making that effort to go and complain about any potential breaches.
No, so from what you're describing, it looks like the government is ring-facing itself about any kind of accountability, transparency.
Yes.
That's what it is about.
Yes, and it is saying we can gather as much data as we want. We
But
can
aapko nahi
exempt
batayenge.
whoever we want,
Yeah.
which includes the public sector and the private sector. And you, the citizen, also have duties. And this is in the clause 15, Pushparaj. It says you will not impersonate any other person.
Yeah.
What does that mean practically for all of us who sometimes need to interact with the digital system for our old parents who may not be that good at it, right? Or for a relative or for somebody who's under any form of disability who's a next of friend.
Sure.
What does it mean that we cannot suppress information which needs to be done by a lot of people in vulnerable circumstances? Basically, every woman in a city who does not want to disclose their complete address, contact and KYC information to every gig provider, given that they want to maintain a degree of their privacy.
Yeah.
This bill penalizes all of this. It says a penalty of 10,000 rupees for every breach can be made on a citizen. This is true Kartavya Kal stuff, yeah. And the thing on remedy, I'd just like to state, if you look at clause 13.3, if I have been aggrieved by the government or by, let's say, a private company, the first thing I have to exhaust is their grievance redressal mechanism. Have we ever got a good outcome from a grievance redressal mechanism? Think of your telecom company or think of the Aadhaar helpline, which is 1947. In fact, I would urge everyone who's listening to this right now to dial 1947 and see if it works. So, okay, you exhaust it. Let's say it works. Then you go to the Data Protection Board and you file that digital complaint in English. It excludes a large number of people, and this is under clause 27B. Now, let's imagine that the Data Protection Board takes a decision which is in your favor. Best case scenario, right? The government authority or the private company did not decide in your favor. You were not satisfied. The board did. Then another appeal can be filed to an appellate tribunal under clause 29. Are you exhausted listening to this?
Yeah.
A person will be exhausted doing this. Now imagine that company or the public authority loses that appeal. Now your data has been breached, you have suffered some financial loss, some hackers have gotten to know how to access your bank accounts. You would imagine you have gotten this judgment and you will get some penalty, some restitution. No. Clause 34 says all the penalties which are imposed on a government authority or on the corporate entity, can you guess where does it go?
Back to the government.
Yes, the
एक
consolidated
जेब से
fund.
निकालो, दूसरे जेब से निकालो.
Bilkul. I just wanted to explain this. Sorry, I went on a little.
No.
There's
Sorry.
just one thing I wanted to add to this, that when you are subject to this appeal, where do you go?
Yes.
Right? If imagine you've got an order in your favor, right? And now the company or the government is saying, no, we want to appeal against this.
Yeah.
Is it in your closest high court, which also is very far for people? No.
Yeah.
It's in the Telecom Dispute Settlement and Appellate Tribunal now,
Yes.
Where is that?
in Delhi.
In Delhi.
Oh wow.
So,
It's very difficult.
And it's not online.
No, and if your complaint is false, as Ria was saying earlier, there's a 10,000 rupee fine on you. So any kind of class action, which is typically the model in data protection breaches, right? Because a single person's or a single data record is not usually, breached. It's usually a class of people. Because data by itself is so voluminous and so easy to store, it may be about 1,000, 2,000 people. So even if there's, like, say, a potentially representative action or 100 plaintiffs, etc., all of that represented by one entity, one non-profit, the fine for it being turned down and being turned a false complaint by itself will be immense.
Yeah, I can imagine.
No remedy.
Yeah. So I want to ask two quick questions before I move on to the wider attack on personal rights and privacy in general,
Yes.
which is something that is important to contextualize, given that this bill is not the only thing that has come about. One is, while the government, I mean, I'm going to cite an example because in Kolhapur, which is where I come from, there were recently some riots that happened, and there have been multiple places in Western Maharashtra they've been having riots. And I don't want to talk about who instigated them. The people who are listening from Western Maharashtra are aware about this. But they had lists of Muslim homes, Muslim businesses, Muslim vehicles, their phone numbers, their places of worship. Places of worship readily recognizable. Businesses, homes, and these are people who are not, all of them are not from Kolhapur. So there are people who are coming from outside roaming around with lists of people. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because the collection of data is one problematic aspect, and the fact that the government alone has the monopoly on to collect data, but the unauthorized use of this data for partisan and ideological ends is something that is of big concern to Muslims across the country and Dalits in many cases. I don't want to get the two of you to speculate on who and what and all that stuff, but I do want to ask you about, because this is a political problem, and I feel that given the next 10 months is going to get very heated up, this is a problem that is going to recur. Do you see that this bill facilitating this kind of collection and possible misuse, but no accountability? Because police authorities can be hand in glove with this kind of
database linking kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think when we think of surveillance, we think, or of excessive data collection, we think often of surveillance, that people are being watched all the time.
Yeah.
The other thing that pervasive data collection allows you to do is social sorting, right? You can sort people, once you collect all of these different types of data, you can sort people into different categories. Advertisers use it to their great benefit. The government uses it for, good, and malicious actors can use it for wrong, right? A data protection bill would ideally try and prevent this by imposing some form of purpose limitation.
Yes.
Saying once you've collected this, you can only use it for this purpose.
Yeah.
There are exemptions in the law that could permit the movement of data between different government departments without you as the citizen having visibility on how it's moving. Right? So I think that's one concern. Apar talked about clause 17(2). Right, where any government instrumentality can be notified and allowed to collect all kinds of data on certain grounds, national security, those kinds of grounds. They're exempt from the purpose, from the entire ambit of the Act.
Yeah.
When they transfer that data to the central government, that is also, the central government is also exempt from the ambit of the Act, right? Without any controls over how this data will be used, without also, in my reading of the Act, any understanding of which part of the central government has access to this data.
Yeah.
Right? When you read 17(2), you see that was a new insertion, that the central government can also use this kind of, use the information collected by an exempted instrumentality of the state.
Sure.
Now, technically, how this is done, of course, this, governments all over the world need to collect sensitive data, need to process it, sometimes outside the ambit of these acts, but it's usually constrained by some principles, right? You have to be able to prove this is necessary and this is proportionate for the particular purpose that you're trying to act out. So those are, I think Apar, you pointed out once that there's a lack of the word proportionality in previous drafts of the bill and this current draft. So I think that's 17(2) is something that I would look at as a stark example.
Okay.
Of how there's no checks on how this data can be collected and how it can move through different departments.
Okay.
पुष्पराज, जो तुमने इंसिडेंट बताया ना अभी, वो आज के भारत में नहीं होना चाहिए और बहुत आसान हो गया है डिजिटल डेटा की वजह से। मैं बताऊं, मैं इसके बारे में मैंने सबसे पहले बारी पढ़ा था लिस्ट्स के बारे में जब दिल्ली में दंगे हुए थे सिखों के खिलाफ 1984 में। तो एक कानून बना हुआ है, दिल्ली सिख गुरुद्वारा एक्ट, जिसके बेसिस पे वोटिंग राइट दिया जाता है जो सिख होते हैं, और बहुत अच्छा कंटेस्टेड इलेक्शन होता है क्योंकि वो अच्छा काम भी करते हैं। जाके देखिए क्लिनिक किसी भी गुरुद्वारा में। तो दंगों में उन लिस्ट का इस्तेमाल हुआ क्योंकि वो लिस्ट गुरुद्वारा से आगे सरकार के साथ भी एक रिटर्निंग ऑफिसर के साथ जमा होती थी। तो अब आप सोचिए कि मतलब हम ऐसे एक भारत में रह रहे हैं जिसमें इफ़ वी ऑनेस्टली एक्नॉलेज देयर इज सच हाई कम्युनल पैशन टुडे, सच वीक रूल ऑफ लॉ, जिसमें मणिपुर में हम देख रहे हैं क्या हो रहा है,
Yeah.
भारत में ही है,
Yeah.
नू में हरियाणा में क्या हुआ है अभी,
Yeah.
हमारे सामने ही है.
Yeah.
तो मतलब द मर्जर बिटवीन स्टेट and illegality sometimes, as it is coming through documented reports in Manipur, is so close.
Yeah.
So when you have this massive trove of real-time data and these surveillance technologies, interlinking of databases, and a complete rubber stamp of approval in terms of sharing, it is a very liberalized regime by itself with intention, which will also be used for these purposes.
Sure,
it is inherent to its design.
Yeah. No, बात नियत की है ना. I mean, if a government, problem is that if the government is unhinged from constitutional or institutional values, it can and will, as we have been noticing in place after place, use your personal data to target you in ways that shouldn't be able to. That's that's a larger, more political, normative question that I guess we're all going to have to think about on how to tackle. But I want to come back to one last thing before I move on to the larger macro thing, is that someone spoke about the fact that it violates the federal structure in that it centralizes data only in the central government. Would you agree with this? And I mean, effectively, isn't the state government saying that हमको भी data दो, हमको भी use करना है?
तो मैंने जब अगर संविधान देखें, मेरे को शायद करेक्ट कर पाए लोग, पर इन दोनों में से एक सही होएगा, मैं मेमोरी से रिकॉल कर रहा हूँ. इन्फॉर्मेशन जो है वो स्टेट लिस्ट में भी है या कॉन्करेंट लिस्ट में है, उनमें से एक लिस्ट में है, जिसके हिसाब से जो कोई भी पर्सनल इंफॉर्मेशन का कानून बनेगा, इट इज एक्चुअली सबसेट ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन बाय इटसेल्फ. तो इसमें हमारे फेडरल पॉलिटी में जो कंकरेंट और स्टेट लिस्ट में सब्जेक्ट्स होते हैं, उसमें उतना ही अधिकार होता है एक राज्य सरकार का जितना यूनियन गवर्नमेंट का होता है. और ये अगर बताऊं, अगर इंफॉर्मेशन टेक्नोलॉजी एक्ट देखें, ये दर्शाता है, तो एक फ्रेज यूज होती है उसमें, अप्रोप्रिएट गवर्नमेंट, जिसका मतलब है कि इम्प्लीमेंटेशन विल बी डन बोथ बाय द सेंटर एंड द स्टेट acting together in a federal polity.
Absolutely.
Now what's happening in this law is that you have wide rule making power without anchoring criteria under the phrase as may be prescribed. You have great powers for the central government, but there is not even one mention of the state government. Now imagine the state government wants to implement a scheme by itself, needs to know the data by itself. It is on the same category as any other private sector data fiduciary, then it is to the union government to give exemptions to the state government for that purpose by itself. This is one area where state power is limited, but centralized power in terms of determining which state government will get that exemption is retained. So in several ways, I would say it is centralizing power with the union government by itself, which is antithetical to our constitutional scheme.
Okay, so I mean, my larger question is that this bill, this is to both of you now. If there is anything else that we haven't covered so far, because I don't want to get into this technical, well in which we are not able to, the general viewer is not able to relate to this thing. So I don't want to get in, but in case there is anything that I have missed out, please feel free to add in whenever you want to. But I generally want to talk about the fact that this bill is not the only bill that chips away at civic freedoms and rights, and there is both of you have been following the case and of course in general the law in general, and I'd like to know about what bouquet of laws and structures have been put into place that undermine privacy and freedoms. Just a broad snapshot would be useful in the last not just 10 years, I would say 15 years.
I think some of the ones, sometimes I think it's good to take stock in this way and then you realize maybe you don't have a complete picture. But some of the things I can think of is one is, the Aadhaar Act. I think that was a big one, and Aadhaar didn't also start as an act. It started with data collection. After a long fight, then there was an act. The act was struck down in crucial parts, recognizing that it creates the surveillance architecture, recognizing that, okay, we have to just limit the purposes for which Aadhaar can be demanded. Subsequently, in the last few years, we've seen how even that kind of has been constrained. The Aadhaar Act marked a big change, and even all that we're seeing now in terms of government use of data marks a change from older schemes of government data collection, like under the act under which the census is conducted, which really limits how that data can be shared.
Yeah.
This is all being transformed. Like in the Aadhaar Act, it's set up to share data, to enable things like KYC, which is good, of course, for business, but it can be used for not good purposes. It can be used to create this kind of surveillance architecture. I think that's one thing that I wanted to point out. There's, of course, the larger point you made about surveillance reform,
yes,
and what's happening in that. So maybe you'd like to...
Yes. So, Pushparaj, the way I would think about this is that over the past 9 years, there's been a marked increase in teleconnectivity.
Yeah.
Let's credit whatever has been the reason for that.
Yeah.
Right? So, you have a tele-density of about 2.4 connections in a city like Delhi, which means that for every one person, there are potentially 2.4 connections, and I know there's marked inequality as the National Family Health Survey, kind of NSSO survey is showing now.
Yeah.
But even then, a lot more Indians are online than they were earlier, which means that the centrality of digital governance needs to follow a constitutional path, which means the government needs to make laws when necessary to protect citizen rights, restrain its own power of the executive branches. But this is not happening. What is happening is this. Laws are not brought in. For instance, Aadhaar doesn't have a legal backing. There's a huge litigation which ensures, and the union government disputes the fundamental right to privacy. So there's a frontal challenge
You're
to
talking about the Attorney General.
what I would call a frontier right of the digital age.
Yeah.
There are mass invasive technologies which are brought in which do not work. It's not too long. We want to forget about it. Think about Arogya Setu. Arogya Setu was mandatory for people who did not even have a smartphone to go back and join manual work in a factory.
Yeah.
And in Noida, they could have been jailed. Think about the government just a few months back bringing in a notification through a delegated rule-making power, having the power to say what is true and false with regard to any report about itself, the fact check, which it will do about itself, which means that journalists, which usually fact check the government, and the government says this is not true, and then the journalists bring more information, cannot happen any longer. And this power allows the government to issue an order to take down that press article or block that website across the entire tech stack, which means even on your messaging platforms. Your WhatsApp end-to-end encryption, potentially used by everyone, the government has brought in a regulation to say traceability needs to be there, which breaks end-to-end encryption as per the opinion of technical experts.
Wow.
Then you have this data protection bill. You have a telecom bill also, which is an entire story in itself. For it remodels the internet shutdown powers. India has the highest number in terms of frequency of internet shutdowns. Manipur is right now under an internet shutdown. And I think till August 5th, Haryana was as well. So I would like to think about this a little much more broadly as G20 happens. When we say that we are building digital public infrastructure, are its foundational values democratic or are they authoritarian? And that's a very important question for us to ask ourselves as Indians.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, when you mentioned G20, I just remember what Riya was saying earlier when we were talking about how many countries look to India as a model state with regard to these rights. Do you want to briefly talk about that? About how it adversely affects our image, foreign policy, so on and so forth?
I think Aadhaar is interesting to see India's impact on the world also. Many countries are developing digital identification programs very similar to Aadhaar. The World Bank is very pleased with the structure of Aadhaar, and they want to replicate it in many places. the fight against Aadhaar has also been very helpful to other countries that have been seeking to fight, to push back against their digital identification programs.
Yeah.
Right? The Jamaican court used Justice Chandrachud's dissent in the Aadhaar judgment, where he said, no, this is not constitutional, needs to be struck down, to strike down their digital identification program. Similar things have happened in other high courts. Now, I think, so India is really poised in terms of being a kind of a lot of countries are looking to India to see how it navigates its journey as a digital, superpower or digital power. What is the implication of it setting really regressive standards in terms of all of the things that Apar mentioned, all of the things we've been talking about, how data is governed, how the government will be responsible for this data? Who is this digital public infrastructure for? Right? Is it for a select few of the private sector, or is it genuinely open access? Can people have some control over it? How is the internet, how is access to the internet curtailed? Right? How is access to the internet sometimes weaponized by making certain things digital, yes. Right? But at the same time, you arbitrarily exercise these powers of shutting down the internet. Right, so looking at how the new kind of world is going to be structured while you're developing these infrastructures of the digital world, I think the rest of the world is looking to India to have something that's truly democratic, that's truly rights respecting. It can set a dangerous precedent if we are going to be, doing kind of race to the bottom, which is what this law is.
So we are the Vishwaguru in the race to the bottom.
We shouldn't be. We
Yeah,
we have such a good, brilliant architecture of governance, of rights in our constitutional framework.
Yes.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
The privacy judgment, if the government genuinely wants to implement it in terms of a data protection statute, it provides very deep theoretical, conceptual and practical, guidance.
Yeah.
So I think we definitely have the potential of posing a model which is truly alternative and persuasive for a large number of developing countries.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank Apar and Ria for joining me. When we put out the video, we'll also be putting out their Twitter, Facebook handles. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to them on your Twitter handles. Do respect their digital, their privacies and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for joining us.